Here is the Denver West line in Denver. They had their own right-of-way. They had tracks there. They said, look, we've already got the tracks. We'll be able to build a light rail cheap. And I said, no, it's not going to be cheap because those tracks are not suitable. They're going to tear out those tracks. They're going to tear out those ties. They're going to start all over from scratch. It's going to cost a lot of money. The original plan was to build a 12-mile line that would cost about $250 million. $20 million a mile. Now, that sounds like a lot. And it is, because a freeway, you can build a 4-lane freeway for $10 million a mile. And each lane of that freeway will carry, on average, 5 times as many people as that light rail line. So that's 20 times the carrying capacity per dollar spent, or the actual use per dollar spent. Now that was a projected cost. When they finally got it done, it ended up costing $710 million, or about $59 million a mile. And even then, to save money, they had to make part of it single track, which means they're going to come back later and say, oh, we've got all these operational difficulties, we have to double track it, so it's going to end up costing well over $60 million a mile. That's about average for light rail transit today. Portland's first light rail line, built in 1986, cost $15 million a mile. Their last one, that's under construction right now, $205 million a mile. So you'll be lucky to get away with spending $60 million a mile on the line to Noble, the Green Line. Now, rail transit tends to go over budget, on average about 40%. By over budget, I mean over the original projected costs. What they do is, they say, well, we're going to project it's going to cost $20 million a mile, but then before we actually start construction, we'll re-project the money and say, it's going to cost $60 million. Then when it ends up costing $59 million, they say, oh, we came in under budget. Yeah, but you came in 3 times the projected cost. Curiously, roads don't have that problem. Roads go over budget, on average, only about 8%. And rails about 40%. And it's consistent. It was 40% in the 1980s, it was 40% in the 1990s, it's 40% in the 2000s. So, Indy Connect says, oh, this plan's only going to cost $1.3 billion. But building a light rail line in the Green Corridor, just that one project is going to cost $1.3 billion, if you're lucky. So there won't be any money left over for any of the other parts that's promised for Indy Connect. On top of that, let's say you can manage to get the federal government to give you a substantial portion of that $1.3 billion. So it sounds like it's free money. What they don't tell you is that there's a huge hidden cost. And that is, every 30 years or less, everything on that line, except for the right-of-way, has to be replaced. The cars, the tracks, the ties, the wires, the stations. If there's elevators or escalators, they have to be replaced. And every city that builds rail transit says, we're going to get the money to build it from the feds, and we're going to pay to operate it ourselves, and we're not going to think about what's going to happen in 30 years, because there's no money. Nobody's going to come up with any money to pay for it. So when the systems get to be 30 years old, they start to fall apart. And this is a report from the Federal Transit Administration. It said there's a $60 billion maintenance backlog in rail transit in this country, of rail systems that are older than 30 years, and they're deteriorating faster than existing maintenance budgets are keeping them up. So that backlog is growing. And what happens when you have maintenance backlogs is you have accidents. This accident happened in Washington, D.C. in 2009. It killed 9 people. And it was because of maintenance failure. They had not maintained the signaling systems. They stopped working. They'd actually stopped working several weeks before this train came by, but they fiddled with it and thought they got it working again, and it wasn't, and it crashed. So you can expect to be faced with another bill in 30 years of replacing everything along that rail line. Now, the advocates will say, but rails are high capacity. It's so much cheaper to operate because you only need one driver for this big train as opposed to several drivers for buses that carry the same number of people. Well, the first question you have to ask yourself is, where do you actually need that high capacity? But the second question is it really that high a capacity? Yes, you only need one driver, but if you want to move people, you have to ask not just how many people can fit on one train, but how many trains can go by per hour. Under typical signaling systems, you can't have a train more than every 3 minutes, a light rail train every 3 minutes. The Washington, D.C. Metro, every 3 minutes. If you have them any faster than that, they're going to start colliding a lot more frequently. You don't want that to happen. So, your light rail trains are light capacity transit. You can only have 3-car trains. You can move about 9,000 people per hour on that track. 20 miles an hour, not very fast. How about buses? One of the interesting things about a light rail system or a streetcar system is if one train breaks down, they don't have passing tracks, so they all end up having to stop. Guess what? If a bus breaks down, the other buses can just go around them. But a single bus stop can serve about 40 buses an hour. That's twice as many as the trains, which can only go about 20 trains an hour. And you can stagger your bus stops. Have 4 bus stops every 2 blocks, one at the front, one at the back of every block. This is the way bus stops are in downtown Portland's bus mall. You stagger your bus stops. That means you can run 160 buses per hour down the street. On a freeway, you can run 600 buses per hour. But let's just talk about city streets. That means you can have 10,000 people per hour going down city streets, about 30,000 people per hour on a freeway. And if you use the new double-decker buses, this bus has double-wide doors to make it easy for people to get on and off, 85 comfortable seats, more than twice as many seats as the single-decker buses. You can move 18,000 people per hour on city streets, 70,000 people per hour on a freeway. Buses are high-capacity transit. Rail is low-capacity transit. And yes, you may need a few more drivers for the buses, but you don't have to maintain the tracks, you don't have to maintain the wires, you don't have to maintain the stations, you don't have to buy rail cars that cost you $5 million each, you only have to buy buses that cost $750,000 each. So you can save a lot of money there. Peter Rogoff is the Obama administration's appointee in charge of the Federal Transit Administration. And he gave a speech a couple of years ago in which he said, after he got the job, he started going around visiting transit agencies, and the first thing every transit agency said to him is, we've got this huge maintenance backlog, we can't afford to keep operating our current trains. And the second thing they said was, we've got this great proposal to build a new rail line. He said, why are you asking us for money to build new rails when you can't afford to run the system you've got? He went on to say, paint is cheap, rails are very expensive. Take a bus, paint it a special color, call it a special bus, and you'll get as many new riders as if you built a train for a lot less money. He said there's a lot of cities that should be looking at this that aren't. So the rail people come back and say, yes, but rails are good for economic development because they're permanent, and developers see that permanence, and they know this community has made a commitment to that area, and so they're going to invest in new developments along the rail line that they wouldn't do for just a bus line. Now you have to wonder how permanent they are when in fact 800 American cities tore out their rail lines between 1910 and 1966. But let's go beyond that and look at the city of Portland, my hometown, my former hometown, which is really the origin of this idea that transit stimulates economic development. Now here's a light rail train in Portland. Oh, excuse me, that's not Portland, that's actually Moscow, Russia. Whenever I see an ugly red and white light rail train in front of an ugly apartment building, I think of Portland. Here's the one in Portland. I should have known the difference because in Moscow it's sunny and in Portland it's rainy. Well, I don't want to say that nobody rides the light rail in Portland, but one time there was a train that came into the downtown that only had one passenger on board. Now, coyotes like to go where they know they can find solitude from people.